"You're obsolete, Beatrice." The words sliced through the Manhattan boardroom like a blade through silk. Marcus Sterling, her protégé and fiancé, stood before the gleaming mahogany table, his voice carrying the weight of calculated betrayal. "The finance world has moved beyond weathered assets like you." Beatrice Vance sat frozen in her executive chair, her 62-year-old frame trembling not from fear, but from disbelief. The board members, people she'd mentored, deals she'd orchestrated, stared at her with the cold efficiency of vultures. No one had defended her in decades. The whispers had started before the gala in New York City. They said Beatrice Vance was too old to be worth keeping in the fast-paced world of technology and finance, too weathered to deserve respect in boardrooms filled with hungry young sharks, too used up to ever belong in the empire she had built with her own hands. Marcus had orchestrated this moment after the board's pressure mounted. One less obstacle to the firm's modernization, one less reminder of the old guard. The crystal chandeliers cast harsh light across the polished conference table, but Beatrice refused to flinch. She had survived 62 years of being underestimated. She would survive this coup, too. Marcus gestured toward the legal documents spread before him. Beatrice Vance, 62 years old, controlling interest in Vance Financial Holdings, ready for immediate retirement. Laughter rippled through the room like poison. Who'd waste a partnership on someone that old? A young analyst jeered from the corner. Then the boardroom doors burst open. A man in a worn leather jacket and mud-stained jeans stood in the doorway. His storm-gray eyes locked on Beatrice as if she were the only person breathing. He was younger, maybe 35, with calloused hands and work boots that had seen better days. But his voice carried the weight of a man who had lost everything and refused to lose again. "You're making a mistake," Brooks Thorne said, stepping into the marble-floored sanctuary of high finance. And in that moment, Beatrice wondered if mercy still existed in this brutal corporate world. Marcus turned to the intruder, his jaw tight with controlled fury. "Security will escort you." "What did her company pay you for selling her out?" Brooks interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. Silence swallowed the boardroom. Even corporate betrayal had its limits of shame. Beatrice's voice cut through, clear and steady. "They offered Marcus the CEO position and a 40% stake, so the firm wouldn't collapse under my outdated leadership." Brooks's face darkened. He pulled out a worn business card and placed it on the gleaming table. "That's my card. I run Thorne Marine Restoration, 15 miles north of Seattle. I need a financial strategist." The board gasped. "A billionaire working with a small-town mechanic?" He turned back to Beatrice, and for the first time in decades, she saw herself reflected in someone's eyes, not as obsolete, but as invaluable. "I'm Brooks Thorne," he said. "I've got a workshop that's been in my family for 3 generations. I need help saving it from predatory developers, but I'm not here to use you like these vultures. If you come with me, it's because you choose to. And if you ever want to return to this world, I'll make sure you have the power to do it right." Beatrice stared, her throat tight. "Why me?" Brooks's voice softened. "Because everyone else sees you as too old, but I see a visionary. And I need someone brilliant enough to help me keep my family's legacy from dying." The words struck her like lightning. She looked around the boardroom one final time, at the empire that no longer wanted her, at the man who had betrayed her trust, at the future that had already forgotten her name. Then she stood, her red power suit a declaration of war against their dismissal. She extended her hand to Brooks, steady and sure. "Show me your workshop, Mr. Thorne." Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The elevator descended through 40 floors of glass and steel, carrying Beatrice away from the wreckage of her life. Her reflection stared back from the polished doors, silver hair still perfectly arranged, red suit still immaculate, but her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had just watched their world crumble. Marcus had planned this for months. Every late-night strategy session, every tender kiss, every whispered promise of their future together. All of it orchestrated to position himself for this moment. The realization hit her like ice water. She had been grooming her own replacement, funding her own destruction with every piece of wisdom she'd shared. Her penthouse apartment felt like a mausoleum when she returned. 40 years of financial newspapers stacked neatly on mahogany shelves. Awards from industry organizations that now considered her irrelevant. Photos of deals that had shaped markets, all reduced to relics of a woman the world had decided was finished. The merger documents lay spread across her dining table like autopsy reports. Marcus hadn't just stolen her company. He had dissected it, selling pieces to the highest bidders while keeping the most profitable divisions for himself. Her nephew David's signature appeared on every page. The young man she had put through Harvard Business School, now her Judas for 30 pieces of silver and a junior partnership. Her phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues. Brief, clinical notes of congratulations on her well-deserved retirement. No one asked if she was ready to retire. No one wondered if she had chosen this path. They simply assumed that at 62, she was grateful to be put out to pasture. Beatrice poured herself a glass of wine and stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline that had been her kingdom. The city pulsed with ambition and hunger, but none of it belonged to her anymore. She was a ghost haunting her own life. The wine turned bitter in her mouth as she opened her laptop and began transferring her personal assets to accounts Marcus couldn't touch. If they wanted her gone, she would disappear on her own terms. But first, she would make sure they understood the true cost of their betrayal. Dawn was breaking over the Hudson River when Beatrice finished her work. She had liquidated everything she could, moved money through channels that would take months to trace, and triggered audit protocols that would keep her former firm's lawyers busy for years. Let them have their victory, but they would pay for it in ways they couldn't yet imagine. She packed a single suitcase with clothes that had never seen the inside of a boardroom. Jeans she'd bought on impulse years ago but never worn. Sweaters that whispered of comfort instead of conquest. Running shoes that might actually touch pavement instead of marble floors. Her car, a modest sedan she kept in the garage while chauffeurs drove her everywhere, started reluctantly. Beatrice had barely driven herself anywhere in decades, but the highway beckoned like an escape route from a burning building. She pointed the car north and west, away from everything she had been, toward something she couldn't yet name. The miles rolled past in a blur of trees and small towns that looked like photographs from someone else's life. She drove through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, places that existed beyond the reach of Manhattan's gravity. Gas stations and diners where her face meant nothing, where her age was just a number instead of a liability. Somewhere near the Washington state border, exhaustion finally caught up with her. She pulled into a rest stop as the sun began its descent, her hands cramping from gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. The Pacific Northwest stretched ahead of her, green and wild and completely foreign to someone who had spent her life in concrete and steel. That's when she saw him. A man stood beside a broken-down pickup truck, his dark hair catching the last light of day. His clothes were stained with grease and effort, his broad shoulders set with the kind of weariness that came from fighting battles everyone could see. He was trying to flag down passing cars, but traffic moved past him like he was invisible. Beatrice recognized that invisibility. She pulled over. "Need help?" she called through her window. He looked up, surprise flickering across features that were handsome in a way that spoke of character rather than privilege. "You don't look like the roadside assistance type," he said, but his smile was grateful rather than mocking. I'm full of surprises. She got out of her car, her expensive heels immediately sinking into the gravel. What's wrong with it? Engines overheating. Radiator hose split about 10 miles back. He gestured helplessly at the steaming hood. I've got a repair kit, but I need water to test the fix. Beatrice looked at his truck, then at her own pristine sedan. I have water bottles in my car. And she hesitated, then made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. I have a full tank of gas and know where I need to be. Where were you headed? About 50 miles north. There's a small coastal town called Haven Bay. I run a workshop there. He studied her face. You sure? I'm just a stranger with a busted truck. Sometimes strangers are exactly what we need. She helped him transfer his tools to her car, trading her silk scarf for his work gloves when the metal proved too hot to handle. Her manicured nails chipped as she helped him secure his equipment, but the small destruction felt like liberation. During the drive, he told her his name was Brooks Thorne, and his family had run a marine restoration workshop in Haven Bay for 3 generations. His grandfather had built boats for fishermen, his father had maintained engines for the Coast Guard, and Brooks himself specialized in restoring classic vessels for collectors and museums. Sounds like meaningful work, Beatrice said, navigating winding roads that hugged the coastline. It was. His voice carried undertones of loss that made her glance over. Market's changing. People want everything faster, cheaper. Restoration takes time, costs money. Hard to compete with mass production. They crested a hill and Haven Bay spread before them like a painting. Small houses clustered around a protected harbor where fishing boats bobbed alongside pleasure craft. Mountains rose green and dramatic beyond the water, and the air smelled of salt and possibility. It's beautiful, Beatrice breathed. It's home, Brooks replied. Or it was, anyway. The Thorne Marine Workshop sat at the edge of the harbor, a collection of weathered buildings that looked like they had grown from the landscape itself. Boats in various stages of restoration filled the yard. Sailboats with naked masts reaching toward the sky, motorboats with their engines spread across workbenches like mechanical puzzles. Brooks's truck limped to a stop beside a building that served as both office and living quarters. I can call you a cab from here, he offered. Get you to a hotel in town. But Beatrice was already getting out of the car, drawn by something she couldn't name. The workshop felt alive in a way her sterile boardroom never had. This was a place where things were built rather than acquired, where problems were solved with hands and tools rather than leverage and manipulation. Your books, she said suddenly. What? Your financial records. May I look at them? Brooks laughed, but not unkindly. Lady, I appreciate the ride, but unless you're an accountant, I've been managing money for 40 years. The words came out more forcefully than she intended. I know numbers, and I know when a business is being strangled by forces beyond its control. Something in her tone made him study her more carefully. You're not from around here. New York. Recently, unemployed. The word tasted strange in her mouth. Brooks was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. Office is unlocked. Books are on the desk. But I should warn you, it's not pretty. The office was a disaster of paperwork and marine catalogs, but Beatrice had seen worse in her early days. She settled at Brooks's desk and began sorting through invoices, receipts, and bank statements. The story they told was familiar and heartbreaking. Brooks Thorne was a master craftsman drowning in the economics of the modern world. His prices were fair for the quality of work he delivered, but customers increasingly chose quantity over craftsmanship. Insurance costs had tripled. Environmental regulations required expensive equipment updates. A large development company had been buying up waterfront properties, driving up his rent and pushing out the fishing fleet that provided much of his business. But underneath the immediate financial crisis, Beatrice saw something else. Opportunity. Brooks's client list included some seriously wealthy yacht owners. His reputation for quality was sterling. He had skills that couldn't be replicated by machines or outsourced to cheaper markets. "You're not failing," she announced when Brooks returned from securing his truck. "You're being systematically eliminated." He paused in the doorway, coffee mug halfway to his lips. "Come again. Whoever's developing this waterfront wants you gone. They're using financial pressure instead of direct confrontation, but the goal is the same." Beatrice spread the papers across his desk. "Look at the pattern. Your rent increases correspond exactly with their property acquisitions. The fishing fleet's displacement was perfectly timed to reduce your customer base. Someone is engineering your failure." Brooks set down his coffee and leaned over the desk, close enough that she caught the scent of honest work and salt air. "Even if that's true, what can I do about it? I don't have lawyers or political connections." "But you have something better." Beatrice met his eyes. "You have integrity. And you have me. I don't even know you. My name is Beatrice Vance. Until yesterday, I controlled a finance firm worth $800 million. She watched his expression shift from skepticism to something approaching awe. "I know how these games are played, and I know how to win them." Brooks was quiet for a long moment. What would you want in return? The question hung in the air between them. What did she want? For 40 years, she had measured success in dollars and market share. Now, surrounded by the tools of creation rather than acquisition, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The desire to build something meaningful. "Purpose," she said finally. "The chance to matter again." They worked side by side through the evening, Beatrice reorganizing Brooks's financial systems, while he prepared proposals for the restoration projects they would pursue. She created spreadsheets that revealed hidden profit centers while he explained the intricate process of bringing dead boats back to life. "You could charge 3 times what you're asking for this kind of work," Beatrice observed, reviewing his estimates for a 1940s Chris-Craft restoration. "These are working people," Brooks protested. "Not everyone's a millionaire. But some of your clients are millionaires. Price your luxury work to subsidize your community projects." She showed him the numbers. "Wealthy collectors will pay premium prices for authentic craftsmanship. Use that revenue to offer sliding scale pricing for local fishermen." Brooks studied her projections, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching hope. "This could actually work." "It will work, but only if you're willing to fight for it." They were interrupted by the sound of vehicles pulling into the yard. Brooks's expression darkened as he looked through the window. Garrett Sullivan, the development company's enforcer. 3 black SUVs disgorged men in expensive suits who looked completely out of place in the workshop's rustic setting. The leader, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of smile that never touched his eyes, approached the office door with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mr. Thorne," Garrett called through the screen. "Beautiful evening for a chat." Brooks opened the door but didn't invite them in. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." Garrett's smile widened. "Actually, I'm here to buy. My clients have made a very generous offer for your property. Triple what it's worth on paper." He gestured around the workshop. "All this history, all this craftsmanship. It deserves to be preserved in a museum somewhere. Don't you think?" The answer's still no. "That's unfortunate." Garrett's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes went cold. "Because my clients are committed to their development timeline, with or without your cooperation." He glanced meaningfully at the wooden buildings. "Electrical fires are so common in old workshops. Insurance companies see them all the time." Beatrice stepped into view then, her presence causing Garrett's practiced smile to falter slightly. She had faced down hostile takeovers and corporate raiders who made this small-town intimidation look amateurish. "Mr. Sullivan," she said pleasantly, "I assume you've filed the proper environmental impact studies for waterfront development? The EPA takes marine ecosystem protection very seriously." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "And you are?" "Someone who knows that threatening arson is a federal crime when it involves interstate commerce." Beatrice's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had destroyed careers with a phone call. "Mr. Thorne's clients include yacht owners from California to Maine. Disrupting that business crosses several jurisdictional lines. Lady, I don't know who you think you are. I'm someone who makes phone calls to people you've never heard of, but who sign your boss's paychecks." Beatrice stepped closer, and despite being half Garrett's size, he took an unconscious step backward. "I suggest you return to your clients with a different message. Tell them that Brooks Thorne's workshop is under new management. Tell them that any further harassment will be met with legal and financial consequences they're not prepared for. And tell them that if any mysterious fires occur in Haven Bay, I will personally ensure that every permit they hold in the Pacific Northwest undergoes the most thorough regulatory review in federal history." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of waves against the harbor pilings. Garrett looked between Beatrice and Brooks, clearly calculating odds he didn't like. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. "The only mistake," Beatrice replied, "would be underestimating what I'm capable of when someone threatens something I care about." After Garrett and his men left, Brooks sat heavily in his desk chair. "You realize you just declared war on some very powerful people." "Good." Beatrice was already pulling out her phone. "I haven't had a decent fight in years." As she began making calls to lawyers and regulators she had known for decades, Brooks watched with something approaching wonder. This elegant woman who had appeared in his life like a guardian angel was systematically dismantling the forces that had been squeezing him toward bankruptcy. "Why?" he asked when she finished her sixth call. "Why are you doing this for someone you just met?" Beatrice looked around the workshop, at the boats being reborn under skilled hands, at the evidence of 3 generations of honest work, at the man whose eyes held pain she recognized from her own mirror. "Because they told me I was obsolete," she said quietly. "Because they decided my experience was worthless and my knowledge was outdated. Because they threw me away like I never mattered." She met his gaze. "I won't let them do the same thing to you." Brooks was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk and covered her hand with his own. His skin was rough from years of honest work, warm and solid and real in a way that made her throat tight. "I lost my wife 3 years ago," he said. "Cancer. The insurance fought every treatment, delayed every approval until it was too late." His voice carried the weight of someone who had learned that the world could be arbitrary in its cruelty. "I thought I was done feeling anything besides anger. And now," Brooks's thumb traced across her knuckles, "now I think maybe we're both exactly where we need to be." Outside, the harbor lights reflected off the dark water like fallen stars. Inside the workshop, 2 survivors began planning their counterattack against a world that had written them off too soon. Neither of them realized they were also planning their future together. The video conference call connected Beatrice to a boardroom she knew all too well, Meridian Development's headquarters in Seattle. 12 faces stared back at her through the screen, men and women in sharp suits who had built fortunes by devouring small towns and spitting out strip malls. Ms. Vance, the CEO, Richard Meridian, leaned back in his leather chair with practiced arrogance. "I understand you've been advising our little problem in Haven Bay." Beatrice's smile was sharp as winter steel. "Your problem, Mr. Meridian, is that you've mistaken me for someone who can be intimidated by a third-rate development company with more lawyers than sense. The controlled fury in her voice made several board members shift uncomfortably. This was the woman who had dismantled corporate dynasties before most of them had graduated business school. Now listen here, one of the younger board members started. No, you listen. Beatrice's voice cut through the conference room like a blade. I've spent the last week reviewing your company's financial structure, and what I've found is fascinating. Over-leveraged properties, regulatory violations in 3 states, and a debt-to-equity ratio that would make a loan shark blush. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on the camera. One phone call to the right federal regulator, and your entire Pacific Northwest operation becomes a very expensive pile of legal problems. Meridian's composure cracked slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? Beatrice pulled out a thick folder and set it deliberately in front of the camera. Environmental impact violations at your Portland project. Labor law infractions at your Spokane development. Tax irregularities that span multiple jurisdictions. She opened the folder, revealing page after page of documentation. I have 40 years of experience in corporate warfare, Mr. Meridian. Do you really want to test whether I'm bluffing? The silence on the call stretched like a held breath. Finally, Meridian spoke, his voice carefully controlled. What do you want? Complete withdrawal from Haven Bay. No further contact with Mr. Thorne or any other property owner in the area. And a formal written agreement that Meridian Development will seek opportunities elsewhere. Beatrice's smile never wavered. In return, I'll keep my very detailed findings to myself. And if we refuse? Then tomorrow morning, copies of this file will be on the desks of every relevant federal agency from here to Washington, D.C. By afternoon, your stock price will be in free fall, and by Friday, you'll be explaining to congressional investigators why your company seems to have such trouble following basic regulations. The call ended 20 minutes later with Meridian's grudging agreement to her terms. Beatrice closed her laptop and found Brooks standing in the doorway, his expression somewhere between admiration and awe. Remind me never to get on your bad side, he said. Too late for that, she replied with a grin. You've already seen me at my worst, and you're still here. The storm hit Haven Bay 3 days later with the fury of a Pacific winter unleashed. Winds that had traveled 1,000 miles of open ocean struck the coast with enough force to make the workshop buildings shudder like living things. Beatrice and Brooks worked frantically to secure the boats and equipment before the worst of the weather arrived. The restored Chris-craft they had been working on sat in the main building, its fresh varnish gleaming under the harsh work lights. That beam's been loose for months, Brooks shouted over the wind as he pointed to a heavy wooden support that ran across the ceiling. Never had time to fix it properly. The words were barely out of his mouth when a massive gust struck the building. The loose beam groaned, shifted, and began to fall with the inexorable weight of decades-old timber. Brooks dove toward the Chris-craft, trying to push it clear, but the beam was falling too fast. It would crush both him and the boat he had spent months restoring to pristine condition. Beatrice moved without thinking. She threw herself against Brooks, her smaller frame somehow generating enough force to knock him sideways as the beam crashed down where he had been standing. They hit the concrete floor hard, Beatrice's shoulder taking the impact as Brooks's arms instinctively wrapped around her. For a moment, they lay tangled together while the storm raged overhead. Brooks's heart hammered against her chest, and she could feel his hands trembling as they held her. You could have been killed, he whispered, his voice raw with emotions he had been holding back for weeks. So could you, she replied, looking up into eyes that held storms of their own. I can't. Brooks's voice broke as he struggled with words that felt too large for his throat. I can't go back to being alone. Not after this. Not after you. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Outside, the storm battered the coast with primal fury, but inside the workshop, time seemed suspended in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Then don't," Beatrice said simply. Brooks helped her to her feet, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he checked for injuries. When he was satisfied she was unhurt, he didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "I know this is crazy," he said. "I know we've only known each other for weeks. I know you're brilliant and accomplished and could have anyone, Brooks. But I can't pretend this is just friendship anymore. What I feel for you, Brooks." He stopped talking and looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the Manhattan executive or the financial strategist, but simply the woman who had thrown herself in front of falling timber to save him. "Marry me," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Not for your money or your connections or what you can do for the workshop. Marry me because you're exactly who I need. Because you're brave and fierce and you make me believe in futures I thought I'd lost forever." Beatrice stared at him. This man who saw her not as obsolete but as essential, who valued her strength instead of fearing it. "Are you sure? I'm 62 years old, Brooks. I'm set in my ways, I'm used to being in control, and I come with more baggage than a luxury cruise line." "I'm sure." His voice carried the certainty of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to lose it again. "I'm sure because when that beam was falling, my first thought wasn't about the boat or the workshop or anything else. It was about you. It was about how empty my world would be if you weren't in it." She reached up and cupped his face in her hands, feeling the rough texture of his beard against her palms. "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." The kiss that followed was desperate and sweet, tasting of salt air and new beginnings. Around them, the storm continued its assault on the coast, but they were safe in the eye of their own personal hurricane. 2 months later, as spring brought new life to Haven Bay, Beatrice stood in the bathroom of Brooks's cottage, staring at a small plastic stick that would have been impossible to explain to her Manhattan friends. At 62, she was facing a miracle that medical science said shouldn't exist. She found Brooks in the workshop, bent over the engine of a fishing boat, completely absorbed in his work. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting everything in golden light that made her think of new beginnings and impossible dreams. "Brooks?" she called softly. He looked up, grease-stained and smiling, and her heart did something that felt like falling and flying at the same time. "Hey, beautiful. How was your appointment with Dr. Martinez?" Beatrice had told him she was going for a routine checkup, not wanting to get his hopes up about suspicions that seemed too miraculous to voice. Now, holding the pregnancy test behind her back, she struggled with how to share news that would change everything. "She said I'm healthy," Beatrice began carefully. "Very healthy, actually. Surprisingly so for someone my age." Brooks straightened, something in her tone catching his attention. "That's good, right?" She also said that sometimes, when two people find each other at the right moment, when they create the right kind of love. Beatrice brought her hands forward, revealing the test with its impossible but unmistakable result. Sometimes miracles happen, even when science says they shouldn't. Brooks stared at the test, his expression cycling through disbelief, wonder, and something approaching reverence. "Are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that at the age of 62, when everyone told me I was obsolete and used up and past my prime, I'm carrying our child." The wrench slipped from Brooks's fingers and clattered to the concrete floor. He crossed the workshop in 3 strides and swept Beatrice into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed with pure joy. "I thought I was too old," she whispered against his neck. "I thought that part of life was over." "You're not too old for anything," Brooks said fiercely. "You're perfect. You're exactly who you're supposed to be, exactly when you're supposed to be it." As the sun dipped low over Haven Bay, they stood together in the workshop that had become the foundation of their new life. The boats around them gleamed with fresh restoration. The business thrived under Beatrice's management, and the future stretched ahead like an uncharted ocean full of promise. 6 months later, the federal agents arrived in Haven Bay not to arrest anyone, but to present Richard Meridian with a warrant for his appearance before a congressional subcommittee on predatory development practices. Beatrice's carefully documented evidence had triggered the largest investigation into corporate land grabbing in Pacific Northwest history. The town gathered at the harbor to watch as Meridian was escorted to a waiting federal vehicle. His expensive suit rumpled and his arrogance finally cracked. Several other Meridian development executives followed, their briefcases and phones confiscated as evidence. Couldn't have happened to a nicer group of people, Mayor Patricia Chan observed with satisfaction. The mayor, along with most of Haven Bay's residents, had rallied around Brooks and Beatrice once word spread about their fight against the developers. Beatrice stood at Brooks's side, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, the other intertwined with his fingers. At 7 months pregnant, she glowed with contentment that had nothing to do with prenatal vitamins and everything to do with finally understanding what it meant to be valued for who she was rather than what she could produce. "Think they'll be back?" Brooks asked, watching the federal caravan disappear up the coastal highway. "Not if they're smart," Beatrice replied. "But if they are, we'll be ready." The workshop behind them buzzed with activity as their expanded team of craftsmen worked on boats that had waiting lists stretching into the next year. Word had spread about the quality of Thorn Marine's restoration work, bringing clients from across the country who were willing to pay premium prices for authentic craftsmanship. More importantly, the workshop's success had breathed new life into Haven Bay itself. The fishing fleet had returned as environmental protections kept the harbor healthy. Young families moved to town as the economy stabilized. The elementary school, which had been facing closure, now had enough students to justify expanding. "You know what the best part is?" Beatrice asked as they walked toward their cottage, Brooks's arm protectively around her shoulders. "What's that?" "They told me I was obsolete," she said with a smile that held 40 years of vindication. "They said I was too old to matter, too weathered to contribute, too used up to deserve love." She paused at their front gate, looking back at the thriving community they had helped save. "They were wrong about everything." Brooks kissed her temple, his hand joining hers on their unborn child. "Their loss was my gain." As the sun set over Haven Bay, painting the sky in shades of promise and possibility, Beatrice Vance, soon to be Beatrice Thorn, stood at the beginning of the most important chapter of her life. At 63, pregnant with her first child, surrounded by love she had never expected to find, she finally understood that some stories don't end with age, they just get better. The workshop's lights came on as the evening crew arrived for their shift, and the sound of meaningful work filled the air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new boats to restore, new lives to rebuild. But tonight, in this small coastal town that had taught her the difference between being valuable and being valued, Beatrice was exactly where she belonged. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.